So the structure for today then, we have kind of three sections I'm going to go through. Why religion is important to learn about for anthropology or any human being. Number two, a little bit about the global religious landscape, just to make you familiar with that, which I think is a really practical thing to be aware of when you interact with culturally diverse populations, which is everybody. And then 13.3, a few insights from anthropology of religion. So with that in mind, let's get rolling. First of all, why is religion important to learn about? Personally, I'm very biased here because it's one of my main specialties as an anthropologist, but I think religion is one of the more important topics you can understand in your college education. So I want to argue that case in a minute, but before I do, I want to point out that when I use the term religion, and in general when anthropologists or other social scientists use the term religion, we mean something a lot bigger than we sometimes use that day in everyday, how we sometimes use that term in everyday English. In everyday American English, we often use the term religion to mean something specific to large-scale organized religious organizations. So people will say things like spiritual but not religious to express the fact that they're not affiliated, for example, with a major sect or denomination. From an anthropological perspective, religion is much broader. It doesn't have to be a big organization. It can be as small as 20 people. It's, as the textbook suggests, a set of beliefs and behaviors that pertain to supernatural forces or beings which transcend the observable world. I like to break apart the word super and natural, as your book does. Your book calls that, beyond the natural. When we talk about religion, it's that thing found in every culture where we have a sense that there's a world beyond, or even a world that overlaps with our own, but which goes contrary to our usual expectations of cause and effect, right? Where diseases happen not because of eating a poisoned food, but because some kind of shaman was involved. Where animals return to be hunted, as in Denina tradition, pre-Christianity, animals return to be hunted not just because the animal walked into your line of shot for your arrow, but because that animal knows, because it has a spirit, that you are a respectful hunter. And so they're things that go beyond sort of our immediately tangible and obvious visible world. And in that regard, religion is found all over the world. So, my point here, and what I'm going to try to point out in this section, is that if you want to understand humanity, which I really think we all should, as I've talked about before, we all have jobs that involve other human beings, where we have to understand and work with other human beings. If you want to understand humanity, you have to understand a little bit about religion. Okay? For a number of reasons. Reason number one, religion's just really widespread, or as I put it, religion is prevalent. It's found in every society. Every society across the face of the world has developed religion. It's what we call a cultural universal. And anytime there's a cultural universal, again, such as marriage, such as art, you have to ask yourself, why? What is it about the human condition that inspires this to always happen in every society, or to have spread among every single society? That doesn't mean all societies are equally religious, and in some societies the rate of religious participation may be much lower, but all societies have some form of religiosity. Furthermore, according to estimates, this is from the Pew Center, which this data is now 10 years old, but I think it's probably still mostly accurate, approximately 3/4 of humanity identifies as a specific religion. And this graph shows you which specific religions, which we'll talk about in a minute. There's an additional, no, I'm sorry, it's not 3.4%. I did the math on that really bad. It's 84%. So approximately 84% of humanity identifies as a specific religion. You then have about 16% of people who do not, a significant portion of whom would be in China, where religion has very strict controls from the government there. But a number of which would be in other countries. Europe has a bit of lower religious participation often in certain parts of Europe than the United States. So you have a number of parts of the world where religious participation is lower. Anyways, 16% unaffiliated. And, even that, though, of that 16%, a lot of those folks still identify or still practice religious things, right? Or they believe religious things. So, for example, you do surveys, and a lot of times, well over 80% of Americans, A, believe in God, and B, believe in ghosts, both of which are arguably religious concepts. And so you don't have to be affiliated with a specific religion to have religious ideas or religious practices. So let's just be conservative even. I think we're being really conservative here, and let's say it's that half of that unaffiliated are people that engage in some kind of religious practice or belief, you then have about 90% of humanity engaging in religion. So, 9 out of 10 chances when you run into somebody that they have some degree of involvement in religion. That may be very important to them, it may be very unimportant to them, but some degree. So, again, you want to understand human beings, you kind of need to understand religion, since a large percentage of humanity belongs to a religion. Religion is also very powerful in its effect, so I have here 3 pictures. The first picture is of Jain nuns. So Jainism is a religion from India wherein monks and nuns, and people generally, but particularly monks and nuns, practice ahimsa, non-violence. So as a result, many Jains have this idea that you shouldn't kill any living creature if you can avoid it. And so for most Jains, that manifests as things like being a vegetarian or a vegan. For monks and nuns, that manifests as even sweeping the ground before you so that you don't step on any bugs, or straining the water, or having a covering over your mouth so that you don't accidentally breathe in or drink in microorganisms. This concept of ahimsa is found within both Jainism, but to a lesser degree in both Buddhism and Hinduism, and directly inspired Mahatma Gandhi's activism against, among other things, certain aspects of the caste system in India, but also more predominantly his activism against British occupation of India, which helped through non-violent resistance, right? Gandhi never led an army. He was an entirely non-violent protester who helped to bring about the end of British colonialism in India. A pretty impressive story, to say the least. His activism and his nonviolence then directly informed the nonviolent resistance and activism promulgated by Martin Luther King Jr. and helped influence civil rights activism within the United States within the 1960s. So religion is powerful, right? Religious ideas do a lot of things. Religion is also pervasive. What I mean by that is it's found in many different places. It doesn't sort of stay put on one day of the week or inside of a holy book, but instead sort of leaks out into many other things. For example, I study environmental issues, and one of the things with indigenous peoples, and primarily in the Southwest and up here in Alaska, and one of the things that we find is that oftentimes environmental issues with indigenous peoples involve sacred lands which have deep personal cultural meanings to a group of people, often related to their sacred origin stories. And as a result, you can't really understand things like the huge resistance to, for example, the huge telescope on Mauna Kea in Hawaii, if you heard about that story, or things like opposition to snowmaking on the San Francisco peaks, or things like opposition to the Dakota Access Pipeline, or even, I would argue, things like the Pebble Mine issue, where you have people who, despite pretty major religious change to Russian Orthodoxy, still have spiritual connections to the salmon and to the water. You can't understand these kinds of environmental issues without taking religion into consideration. At the same time, religion affects things as banal and everyday as the profanity people use. And so a number of our swear words use some version of the name of God. And, or as another example, among Quebecois people living in Quebec speaking French, this word here is basically an abbreviated version of tabernacle, specifically referring to the tabernacle within Mass, where the host is held. So it's profanity, and one that's potentially quite offensive, perhaps, depending on one's beliefs, but it's rooted in religion, right? So whether or not we realize it, we're using religious expressions. TV shows, to get even more mundane. I love the TV show Supernatural with Sam and Dean. Recently I was watching the NBC series Evil, which I thought was very good, and involved sort of a team that investigates whether or not miracles and exorcisms are legitimately supernatural or something else. And it involves, a team of, a believer and a skeptic and sort of an agnostic, working together to figure these things out. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and the list goes on and on. Even, Marvel, right? Thor, God of Thunder. That didn't come from anywhere. That's from actual Norse mythology. So, by which I mean sacred stories. So it's all over our popular entertainment. It's also all over our elections. So, 2 things from the most recent election to point out. Arizona, most likely, they're still counting votes and they haven't certified, but most likely will remain in the blue category, certainly on the Senate, if not on the presidential race, but most likely on the presidential race as well. And that is not insignificant for a couple of reasons from a religious perspective. One, the fact that Arizona has voted red so many times is at least in part because of pro-life populations that oftentimes have religious affiliations that have therefore often voted Republican. The fact that it has flipped blue in this election is most likely is probably for many, many different reasons that you have to consider. But one of which that some scholars have brought up is the fact that Phoenix, Arizona, the largest city, has a somewhat above average percentage of Latter-day Saints or Mormons, as you may be more familiar with the term, who have been, although many do vote for President Trump, had a perhaps less support of him than previous Republican presidents for a number of different reasons. And people have brought up, for example, sort of the sometimes crude expressions that he uses, or people have brought up his stance on immigration. So Latter-day Saints are oftentimes more moderate or left-leaning on immigration than they are on a lot of other political issues. And, there's an increasing number of Latter-day Saints who are shifting more leftward. So you have, changes even within a religion, which at the national level is kind of a blip in the radar, right? But at local levels, places like the Intermountain West, that's, where you have a higher percentage of a specific religion. If the religion is starting to react to politics in a certain way, that can actually contribute to a flip in the state. Other things as well, though. The Navajo vote went overwhelmingly blue this time around, and so that's another thing. So it wasn't only, I'm not trying to solely place it on sort of one denomination within Arizona, but I'm just suggesting that religion contributes to why states vote a certain way or another way. The fact that Joe Biden will most likely be, appears to be, I should say, the president-elect, and he is the second Catholic president that the United States has ever had. That shows how pervasive religion is, in the sense that the presidents of the United States historically have been overwhelmingly Protestant Christian. And that has just been the overwhelming trend. Having a Catholic president has been very, very unusual. And indeed, this didn't come up much this time around, but when John Kennedy was elected as the first Catholic president, that was quite a sticking point for some people. People kind of felt that was too far outside of the American mainstream. So partly that's demographic, of course, with Protestantism being larger pound for pound than Catholicism in the United States, even though Catholicism is quite large. But partly that's sort of part of a hegemonic understanding of who should be elected president and who shouldn't, right? A significant number of people opposed Mitt Romney's Republican nomination on the grounds of his religious background. The fact that Ben Carson is a Seventh-day Adventist came up within his nomination run for Republican candidate, all brought up by one or two of his opponents. And so these things matter, right? They're pervasive. Religion leaks into a lot of other aspects of our lives. Religion also kind of shapes some of the ways that a culture thinks about its most basic, profound questions. So, for example, in Buddhism, Buddhism starts with the enlightenment of Siddhartha Gautama and his understanding of the Four Noble Truths, these kind of four most basic truths of reality, which is that life has suffering or is suffering, that there's a cause to that suffering, an end to that suffering, and that follows the Eightfold Path. But that question of what is suffering kind of pervades all of Buddhism, and it's really a basic human question, and we can really look at almost any religion across the world and find that most religions are an answer to one or several of our most profound basic human questions that most of us grapple with. How do you have a successful family? How do you ensure that you have enough to eat and prosper in the future? How do you ensure that your society has a good, strong moral order? How do you, what's to come of our soul? Do we have a soul, right? Religion answers these kind of basic square one kind of questions, or at least seeks to answer them. And so that's another reason I think it's worthwhile to study religion. So far, it's important to understand religion because it's so prevalent among human beings, because it's so powerful among human beings, because it's so pervasive in so many parts of human society, and because it speaks to such profound basic human questions. All of that to suggest that if you're going to be interacting with human beings in your future, in your life, in your job, which is all of us, then, it pays off to understand a little bit about religion. I'm not saying you have to make a major of it, but at least to have a little bit of understanding of it and to be thoughtful and sensitive to it in the same way that you should be thoughtful and sensitive to issues like race and ethnicity, issues of ability and disability and neurotypicality and atypicality, issues of sex and gender. All of these are kind of issues that to be a human interacting with other humans, diverse humans, you should be at least baseline familiar with. You're going to be a social worker, guess what? Some of your clients are going to be religious, probably a lot of them are, and so you need to understand how that affects their family practices, for example. You're going into petroleum engineering or petroleum management. Hey, guess what? You're going to go out to work on the North Slope, people that are potentially away from their family for months at a time. When people are in crisis modes like that or times of stress, they oftentimes, where they may, be feeling kind of alone, they oftentimes turn to religion, and that might be quite important to them. So understanding religion might help you understand a coworker. It also might help you understand why certain land projects are uncontroversial and other land projects are very controversial. Based on indigenous beliefs about specific landscapes. Fish and game management, congratulations, right? Religion is, again, very, very important. I spoke before about the example of pebble mine and people's sort of spiritual attachments to salmon and how that affects how they think about whether or not the pebble mine should go through. Marketing, you're going to go into advertising. Congrats, you need to understand religion, among other things, so you don't do ads that are unintentionally offensive to religious groups who may be a significant part of the customer base that you're working with. So for all these reasons and many more, I think it's really critical that we study these topics and at least have a basic familiarity with them.